The purpose of this video is to learn to differentiate the various types of vertebrae within the human body and to learn the basic structures of each of the vertebrae. We will begin with the cervical vertebrae. There are 7 cervical vertebrae within the human body. Now when we look at the cervical vertebrae, the first thing we're going to look for is we're going to look and identify that it is indeed cervical vertebrae. So as we look at this right here, a typical cervical vertebrae, we'll notice that on either side we see a little hole. And those holes, as we look at them, are going to be located right here and right over there. There we go again. Looking at the cervical vertebrae, we have the transverse foramina, and that's what we're going to look at to determine that this is indeed a cervical vertebrae. Notice at the top, the spine area, it is branched. That is typical of a cervical vertebrae. We'll also have the body part, which you'll see being held in the center, and then the open area is for the vertebral foramina, which is where the spinal cord and the various blood vessels and nerves run through. So this is a typical cervical vertebrae. The first 2 cervical vertebrae in the human body have specific functions, therefore they have specific names. The first vertebrae of the body is called Atlas, from Greek mythology, Atlas that held up the world. And again, we can look at this right here and we can determine that right there and right there we have our transverse foramina, so that this is cervical. Also notice that in this area and this area right here we have a flattened surface, and that's where the occipital condyles of the skull attach and will rest upon the atlas. Our second cervical vertebrae allows for rotation of the skull, and when we look at it, we can see this structure right there, which is called the Odontoid Process or dens. Now notice that is right across from our spinous process. So we look at it there again, and that's what we're going to look at to determine the axis. When we look at this, the axis will press into the vertebrae when one receives whiplash, and it's the amount of pressure that we have from this odontoid process into the vertebrae that causes the various degrees of whiplash. So again, we can see our transverse foramina, and we can determine that it is a cervical vertebrae. When you're working with cervical vertebrae, you will need to differentiate that it's cervical vertebrae and then look and determine, is it one of our 2 types of cervical vertebrae? Is it our atlas with our odontoid process, or is it our axis where we have the flattened surfaces for the occipital condyles? The second vertebrae that we have in the body, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. These are thoracic because these are the ones where the ribs attach. So again, it is going to have all the typical structures that we see on a typical vertebrae. It will have the spinous process. It will have the body right along in here. It will not have the transverse foramina. It is not cervical. And therefore what we have to look at is we have to look very closely, and you'll notice that right here we have a structure called the rib scars. And they are rib scars because this is where the ribs attach. Only our 12 thoracic vertebrae will have these. Now keep in mind that our 7th cervical vertebrae and our 1st thoracic will look identical, with the exception that our thoracic will have our rib scars while our cervical will have the transverse foramina. The third type of vertebrae we have in the body is the lumbar vertebrae. Again, there are 5 lumbar vertebrae within the human body, and the 1st lumbar and the 12th thoracic will look identical in shape and size, except our thoracic will have the rib scars, while our lumbar will have none of those. So when we look at a typical lumbar vertebrae, what we're looking at is, first, we're going to look at it and determine that there are no transverse foramina. Therefore, this cannot be cervical. The next thing we're going to look at is the side, and there will be no rib scars. And since there's no rib scars, no transverse foramina, it rules out the first 2, leaving lumbar as our choice. Finally, we reach the sacrum, which is our shield-shaped vertebrae, and at the tip end we'll have our 3 fused cervical vertebrae. And that's how you differentiate the various types of vertebrae within the human body. With this video, I would like to show you 2 additional bones that we run across. Here we go. The first one over here to the left is what the hyoid bone looks like. Now we'll put our finger right here, right next to it. There we go. And you'll notice the size. It is a fairly small bone. This is located right under the jaw. It is the only bone that is not directly connected to any other bone in the body. It is attached to the tongue muscles. This is the bone that is crushed if someone is strangled. Now the bone on the right, that is going to be our first rib. Many professors like to use this on the lab practical because it is somewhat confusing. Students will confuse this with the hyoid bone and also with the lower jaw called the mandible. However, if we were to take this bone and we were to proceed right over to our skeleton, and we were to look at the skeleton and we were to move up here to the top, moving the arms out of the way, we will see that right up here at the very top, right in there, that's where we have that bone located. So it is small, but it is a rib bone.